Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Nicolas Brown. Based in London, Nick is a seasoned agility and product consultant with a career spanning e-commerce, financial services, and professional services. He's led on the adoption of agility at companies like PwC, Nationwide, Royal Mail, and ASOS, focusing on ways of working, product thinking, and organizational flow. Currently, he works as a principal flow consultant at Thrive Partners, that's with two V's, helping teams build great digital products fast. You can follow him on X at nbrown02 and check out his website at nicholasbrown.co.uk. Nick is the author of the book Real World Agility, Backed by Evidence Built for Results. In the book, Nick talks about flow, value and culture, and other agile concepts from a real-world perspective. In this interview, we're going to talk about Nick's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing a book. So thank you very much, Nick, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Len.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career in London and in Agile.
Sure. So I grew up in Leeds, which is in the north of England, in a county called Yorkshire, God's own county, as we would call it. So I was living in Leeds till 18 years old. Then I went to university in Newcastle, Northumbria Business School. Then lived in France for a year. Went to uni in France for a year. Came back, finished in Newcastle, and I've always been into tech. I'd say, like my very first work experience, I worked in a computer shop up the road, and up the road in Leeds, not so much now. And we used to kind of rebuild PCs with secondhand parts, or like triage customer issues that they had with their software or hardware. And at uni, I wrote a dissertation about how the cloud could help small and medium businesses. And I remember people ask what is this cloud thing? Like, you need special permission because no one knows what the cloud is. So I've always been kind of like interested in like the next big thing in tech or just tech in general. And after uni, couldn't get a job anywhere in the north. So I moved down to London, worked in a graduate scheme for a kind of an IT professional services outsourcing firm that was kind of doing some cloud stuff, but not really cloud as we know it now. So it was working with different clients. It could be like leading on projects. It could be helping things from an IT service management perspective. And I got to a point where I was like racking servers in a data center on a Friday night. And I was like, this is so boring. I need to do something more exciting. I went to Royal Mail Group, kind of biggest logistics company in the UK. And I was working in kind of delivery role for the e-commerce journeys on the website. So if you want to track a parcel or you want to find how much it costs to send an item, we were rebuilding all those journeys on the website. And that was when I kind of fell into Agile, just completely by accident. We were working on some stuff, and the company that was kind of doing our IT development was like, we want to use this approach called Agile. You can use Scrum, you can use Kanban. And in some instances, it was good. It was, I guess, Agile by the book, if you will. So kind of, continuous delivery type practices. Others, it was more water scrumful, people might call it. So lots of development, and then one still big deployments, really getting the benefits of agility. And that's when I got exposure to things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, automated testing, putting stuff out, and be confident that it wasn't going to fail, rather than doing deployments at like 3 a.m. in the morning. And then I moved to PwC in an internal role with a business intelligence team, a data reporting team. And then the role changed to kind of coach other people about agility and the different agile projects we had going on in technology. And then the role changed to be defining what a future operating model might look like for tech. And I got to the point where I kind of needed a new challenge. I moved to Nationwide, which is a financial services building society. I was there for about 16 months, and then I moved to ASOS. I spent nearly 3 years at ASOS. Loved my time at ASOS, best place I've ever worked. And now I work at Thrive. So I've moved from being, I guess, a permanent employee in an organization towards more kind of being able to work with multiple organizations, understand the challenges they're facing, seeing if there's commonalities, draw my experience, and kind of help them get better that way. So that's kind of the whistle-stop tour of the last 14 years of my career.
That's really great story. One interesting sort of detail you left over there was I moved to London and got a job. Having done that myself, I know how many different stories can be summarized that way. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, maybe for someone listening now who's, from somewhere else in the UK and is thinking of moving down to London and getting a job. I mean, what do you do? Did you have friends there? Did you know where you were moving to?
So I knew one person, my friend Jamel. He's still a really, really good friend of mine. Um, and when I was moving, London is its own kind of country in a way within the UK. I think anyone that's lived in and then outside of London will probably attest to that. And I remember I organized like flat viewings, and I would get, because I just finished university, I didn't have a job. I would get like the megabus, which is like a bus you could get for like £1, I think it was, or it might have been very cheap, like down to London, and it would take like 6 hours. And then I have a day of viewings when I get the megabus back. And I remember just being amazed at how expensive it was, and looking at what I was going to be earning, what I was going to be paying rent, and what little I would have left over to explore London. And this was before any sort of like virtual working or anything like that. So I think the times have changed a bit now. I think back then it was kind of like you need to move to London in order to get the compensation you want, get that life experience. I don't think it's as much of a necessity now. But yeah, I think being prepared to compromise on your living situation is probably the biggest thing that I would advise for people if you're wanting to live like quite centrally. So if you're thinking that you're going to be living and going out and also saving, and then you're going to be on the property ladder in a few years, it doesn't work like that anymore. So be prepared to be surprised at just how expensive things may be.
Yeah, it's funny. I moved to London from Canada, I guess basically a generation earlier. And a friend of mine and I, we arrived in London. We were staying in a hostel, and we just get up at like 5 a.m. And there was a particular like printed paper that we'd get that would be just put out right at like 5 a.m. And we'd go grab the freshest copies and go flat hunting based on that, because things would get snapped up really quickly, even in those days. And the flat we ended up with it was a studio flat. So it had a kitchen and a room, and it had a couch that was a pull-out bed. So for a year, we lived switching every night, to be fair, one guy on the floor and one guy on the couch. And that's like not an unusual
Yeah,
type of thing for young people moving to London.
I was amazed at the amount of places I was looking at where there was no like communal living area. It was just like your room and your kitchen, and like that was it. And I was like, oh my God, like how do you socialize? And that was quite common, that any sort of flat that had communal area had then been turned into more rooms. So yeah, that was quite an eye opener for me.
Yeah, I remember once I had an Australian roommate, and she would that my joke when we were talking before, but that meant there was always at least two Australian roommates. And one we had a closet in this one flat. This was when I was living near Angel Station. We actually had a closet, and I remember a guy visiting was like, you could rent that out. Windowless closet, but it was big enough to sleep in. It was like, wow, like that's like, but I understood, I got it, like if you can, like someone could, if you have a place to sleep, that you can afford in a central place, you're doing pretty good. And particularly if you're young, like you can frame things as an adventure and things like that. So it makes it a little bit easier to take. Um, so yeah, so that's very interesting. So, what was it like, working for the Royal Mail?
Um,
I mean, I'd be working for a big organization. All of a sudden, you find yourself in there.
yeah, I mean, it was interesting because it was a time when Royal Mail was going from government owned to like having shareholders, and that was supposed to take the reins off a little bit of the organization, and I guess make the organization more agile. Um, Certainly when joining, I was amazed at just how much process there was. So, I'd come from an organization, maybe 250 people, advanced computer software. So like if you wanted to get a project done, you go through various steps and then you get the project done. Whereas at Royal Mail, I remember a tech they had a tech investment committee that would approve any project starting. and you had to prepare papers and a business case, which is fine. Preparing a business case is fine. But then after that, every time your project wanted to go to the next phase, you had to go to what was called a gating committee. And they only met every 2 weeks. And you would have like change management, solution architecture, enterprise architecture testing. And you had to get an approval from every one of those representatives to move to the next stage. So like when you talk about agility, that like was really not agile at all. And particularly when like you needed to get approval to go from dev to test. It's like, well, how are you going to do like continuous delivery type stuff? It just doesn't work like that. So it was eye-opening to me just how much bureaucracy an organization could have. And it was well intended, because ultimately it was like, we don't want to put out a product, physical or digital, that could upset users or could lead to a negative brand reputation. But I remember like thinking at the time, like, wow, this is like quite a heavy process just to get something done. So yeah, that was probably the biggest eye opener for me. And then, you know, similarly kind of like always wearing a suit and tie to work and things like that were always quite interesting. That was kind of, I had a period where I was like really into like my suits, not now, but I was always like wanting to stand out a bit in that regard. So yeah, it was quite a baptism of fire. That whole process side of things. I mean, like, oh, these are all the things I need to do just to move on to the next phase. I can't just grab someone and say, this is what we're going to do in the next few weeks, and then just giving me the thumbs up. So yeah, that was quite surprising.
And it's very interesting. So I was just looking at your LinkedIn, and was one of the projects you worked on getting like a kind of like barcode on every package or something like that? I mean,
yeah. So
we bring that up as a specific example because it's like, you know, we could talk about like projects and delivery and you know and stuff like that. But like, well, I mean, now we're talking about literal delivery, but like, you know, it is like the Royal Mail, for anyone listening, that's a big deal. Like in the UK, to, you know, this with the long history. I mean, I was there when they renamed it Consignia briefly, which was very funny. And like a huge controversy, but like change within an organization like that, developing a new thing, like putting barcodes on all packages is like a big deal, like for the changes the way everything moves around the whole, or things move around the whole country. So what was that? Just maybe talk a little bit about that project, what that was like.
yeah, so for people that you know in 2025, probably people probably wouldn't like, what do you mean a new barcode? So at the time, so it's about 2014, 2015, whenever you sent a parcel, you would have like a 1D barcode. And 1D barcode is like what you get in supermarkets, or when you scan an item at self-checkout, it's got a 1D barcode and it's just kind of white lines like that. A 2D barcode is like a QR code. And the reason for doing that is that they're much more data rich, but also from a revenue protection standpoint, they're much more, they preserve people producing fraudulent mailing, so like false packages, that kind of thing. So it saves the organization a lot of money. It's a lot of cost prevention. So what we were doing is there was a bigger program called barcoding all parcels, which were just, we want this 2D on everything. Where I worked in the e-business side, so it was within the online postage journey. It was users would go through that journey and it would generate a 2D and a 1D. And I think now they don't even have 1D anymore. It's just 2D. So that involves so much change, because you had to consider, well, the typical size of a label is this, but then we're adding another barcode. So where's that going to go? So to resize the labels, you had to work with like all the fraud teams around, well, how are you going to validate that this post is real? So what a lot of people don't know is that whenever you send parcels and they go to like a distribution center, parcels will be picked at random and the barcode will be scanned to verify that someone has actually paid for that postage. Because what a lot of people actually do, maybe not so much now, is produce fraudulent barcodes, but they get through the system. So they'll take it, they'll put the label on, they'll put it in a post box, maybe not so much, you know, a massive shoebox. But if you're sending like, I don't know, a book to someone, you could generate a kind of fake postage letter, post in letterbox, that would get processed through the system, and then it would end up at the end user and you've not paid any postage. So then there's money lost for the Royal Mail in that regard. So you had to work with all the revenue protection teams around, well, how do you scan this new barcode? And we had to build an app just for them to scan these barcodes. So there's so much change involved. And I remember actually, not long after it went live, one of the things was a lot of customers that would print their own labels would have what's called a franking machine. And that would print the labels for them. And this new label size, it actually caused loads of franking machines to break and loads of customer complaints. And it was a scenario that we hadn't tested for. And it was a great learning for me about kind of like agility and testing sooner and getting feedback sooner. Because that was where we didn't have it. We made that mistake. So yeah, like at the time, and probably ever since, it's probably the biggest project I've ever been involved in terms of the impact on the organization and the visibility and also the budget that came with it. So yeah, it was quite a big deal.
Yeah, and then you moved on from there to PwC, where you worked actually like training internal teams on Agile. And I was wondering if you could just take a few minutes to talk to us about what that was like. That must have been very interesting.
Yeah, so it's funny, really, kind of, big four consultancies sell organizations this kind of dream around digital transformation and agility, but actually within their own organizations aren't as good, would be a fair statement, I think, to make without being too negative at that kind of thing. And when I joined at the time, I actually wanted it to be a segue into like a client-facing role. I was like, well, I've not done client-facing stuff in the past. That's where I think I want to go in my career. So I'm going to join an internal team and get them really good. And then people on the client-facing side were like, oh, let's get this guy in front of clients. And I did have that opportunity, but it wasn't right for me. But it was, it was really quite eye-opening, kind of, the things that we market to clients around being cutting edge and digital transformation, yet how little of that was known about internally. So having to do really basic education around things like Agile. And, we had to start with, when we formed a coaching team a few years later on, with like just really kind of basic, like 90-minute sessions. And then that became half-day training, and then it came 1 day and then 2-day training. But I remember at the time, a lot of it was just having to spend a lot of time with people explaining, like, this is why we work this way. This is how it's different in the past. This is the benefit it brings. And it taken a lot of attempts for people to get that, and a lot of people trying to understand how they could enable that sort of environment to succeed rather than viewing it as a threat to their role. So, things like, oh, this team is coming cross-functional, so that means my role doesn't exist. So I'm not going to enable this team to succeed. I'm going to be more of a process blocker in that regard. So yeah, and then it was kind of really interesting the evolution of a role from being with one team towards more of a coaching role. And I was so lucky. I worked with a coach called Basil Arden, who works for a company called Ripple Rock. And I was like a sponge. I kept asking him question after question after question. We got him in to help our business intelligence teams because we were building like a portfolio. We had multiple teams and no idea how to do that kind of thing. You could argue it's at scale, a very small scale, just more than one team. And I was like, I have no idea how to do this. And he just knew so much. And like every challenge we faced, he had an answer, and he showed me how to do stuff and do stuff in a better way. And that's when I got into the whole data side of things, when he was showing me how, you could better use data for improvement or managing expectations from a delivery perspective. And I was talking to him the other day and was saying, yeah, I mentioned him in the book, in the acknowledgements, just how much I owe to him, because he just taught me a great deal. And it was great. It was an environment where there was a lot of empowerment. And I think that would surprise people given the large organization it is and what people would typically associate. But in the technology organization, I have to say, I was fortunate to have leaders around me that really believed in me and believed in that stuff. So they could empower me to be the best at my job that I could be.
And so it was there that you really got into your focus on data and things like that.
Yeah, it was the work with Basil. I worked with another guy called Tim Bayer. And again, I mentioned Tim in the book. Tim was a data scientist, and he was the one that taught me all about like data visualization and storytelling with data. Tim's like a genius in my eyes. How more people don't know his work is amazing to me. But he taught me all about, if there was a story we're trying to communicate, the best type of chart to use, and then how to build visualizations. And he showed so much patience because I was starting from scratch. I'm never was proficient at Excel or anything like that. And he taught me so much about kind of, this is how you can visualize, this is how you can tell that story. So then when you're communicating that to people, it's easier for them to understand. And that's when I started building kind of my own open source stuff as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some time to talk about a lot of that in a little bit. But just carrying on with your story, so then you moved on to you moved on to Nationwide, which you talk about in actually a couple of podcasts that I listened to preparing for this interview. And it's you have a very funny line where you're like, the CEO at the end of one kind of financial year was like, "We made an obscene amount of money this year," and you're like, "What's there to change? Like, what's there to improve? Like, we're doing good." Sometimes you can just find yourself in that situation too. And you moved on to ASOS, which is fast fashion, and the tech, a very tech heavy kind of company. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think you were on a smaller team there, but sitting on top of like dozens of technology teams.
Yeah, so probably 1/3 of ASOS's organization is tech, and there's often the debate internally: a fashion company or a tech company. And I was very lucky in that ASOS is an organization that years ago invested a lot in things from an agile perspective, and it has a really good culture, so people stick around, so that learning persists. So ASOS didn't have things like Scrum Masters or Agile delivery managers. They used to, and then they got rid of them. And they pushed more of that stuff to teams. So it had roughly 100 teams in technology. At its most, we were a team of 5 coaches. By the time I left, we were 3. And it is very much kind of steering the organization around what good looks like from an agile perspective, and kind of giving teams that direction, saying, right, these are the kind of things that we look for from an outcome perspective. Like, if you're a real agile team, this is what we would expect to see. How you get there is going to be different from team to team. And if you want help with practices that will help you get there based on what we've learned over the years, then we can coach you through that. But we're not going to babysit you, and we're not going to do it for you, because we couldn't at that scale. So it's very much kind of like, okay, these are the things that we think would be good to look at. This is how we measure the agility of teams and of the organization. So if you want to do some of that stuff, then we're happy to help. That was the other thing. I've worked in organizations or teams within organizations where you've kind of been having to sell agile, or you've been part of like a go agile transformation, if you will. ASOS doesn't have that in its culture. It's kind of like, well, why would we work any other way? That's just bonkers. So you were never having to sell it to people. You might be having to sell more modern agility practices compared to what they're used to using in the past or have done elsewhere. So yeah, it was as a coaching team, it was like, oh, right, what do we think good looks like? What initiatives can we lead on that teams can opt into, that can help them with that and can help us get to the outcomes we want in terms of faster flow of work, or more value being delivered, or better usage of data in delivery. So yeah, and that was very much kind of the stance we took, was like, okay, we'll divide areas where we're the point of contact. So if you've got 20 teams in one area, 15 in another, they know who the coach is they can come to. But we're not going to go to every team's daily stand-up or daily scrum or every team's retro, because we simply couldn't, because the amount of teams. But also, you can only go to so many of them before you're not really actually adding value. And that was a key thing for us as coaches, is we want to be able to demonstrate the value we add, while still, not teams kind of opting in to how they want to work and choosing how they want to work, rather than us rolling out a scaling framework and everyone mandates that. So yeah, it was very empowering and very much kind of direction setting rather than kind of framework installing.
And what's an example? I mean, there are all these teams. What's an example of a team in this context? Is it like people who make features that let's say, are we talking about like features for a website? Are we talking about features for internally for like, kind of like, I don't know, setting up a process for creating a new item for sale.
Yeah, I mean, it could be any of those. So, we would have, and ASOS is moving now towards more of a, what people call a product operating model. So when I left, that wasn't actually, they were just starting that journey. But when I was there, the majority of the time it was more of a platform model. So teams consume services that are available from other platforms. So things like a bag API that another team monitors, looks after, updates. So very much kind of microservice driven architecture. So you'd have like a bunch of web teams that would own different services of the web application, apps teams split that iOS and Android. You'd have teams that would like look after the software we would use for video shoots in like the studios in the office, all the way to, I remember one of the first teams I worked with, it was a web application that was just a database of suppliers we use for different fashion products and looking at things like the practices they adopt from an ethics standpoint, whether they source their materials, that kind of thing. So it was a whole range of stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, the more sexier stuff is the teams that are doing the front end stuff, because then you can kind of like relate to it as, your everyday user. But it all plays a part. You might be working with teams that are setting up a new distribution center in a different part of the country. And it's like, how agile do you make that? And varying degrees you can. But then you can start to see how it all ties into the journey.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I guess it's an industry I've never really like thought about a lot before, but like, I can just imagine what it must be like sort of working with that environment, like I'm working in the sort of handbag division. And what I want is all the resources I can possibly have that work as best as they possibly can for me to design something. Then I need to source like the buckles. I need to justify what I think my sales projections are going to be, how I'm going to sell it. And then I've got maybe someone else in the same company who's like, competing for space on the homepage or something like that. And then we've got to justify why we want this spot or that spot. And, that it just sounds like really interesting kind of environment to work in with like sort of, and then obviously fast moving and things like that.
Yeah, because it like they have to have agility in all parts of the organization. So like even like we were working within technology, so as a tech teams we were working with, but you can see little sprinkles of it everywhere. Like I remember when you start, you get your tour of the office and you go up to like second floor, and that's where they do the video shoots in the London office. And the team that do the editing, I was told, so I'm taking it as truth, they were moved from where they used to sit to be next to the studios, because it doesn't make sense for them to be on the other side of the office, does it? It's kind of having them side by side. Another thing that really has taken off in the last year or so is this concept of test and react, which is where rather than buying, hundreds of a particular type of white t-shirt, and then let's say only 20 sell, and then you've got, hundreds that are sat in the warehouse somewhere, and you're having to sell them for £1 on a sample sale website, and you make a loss. They started rolling out more this thing called test and react, which is where you take a small batch and you put it out there, and if people buy it, then you buy more, and if they don't, then you haven't increased your exposure so much as like when you bought hundreds. So there's kind of little sprinkles of that, and you're not involved in it as a coach, but you understand like how much agility is as a necessity for an organization like that to be fast, to appeal to fashion loving 20 somethings. You can't be slow. So yeah, that's kind of, it's really interesting just seeing those different sprinkles in the organization and how they could relate to what it is that you do.
So, following your journey, we've worked our way up to the present, basically. And the present is your book, your awesome new book that's out, Real World Agility. And just to begin the discussion of that, we've used the word a lot already, and we've used some code words as well, like Agile. And we've used like Scrum and Waterfall, and I think you said something like Water Scrum or something like that, which I hadn't actually heard before, but I can see where it comes from. But for anyone who's been mystified this whole time, before we go on to talk about your book, can you talk a little bit about what agility is and what it is distinguished from?
What agility is? So I would say it's working working as a team to deliver value quickly whilst always trying to get better. So rather than working as a team to just deliver a project and not caring about the outcome, for example, if we focus the lens on value, then we have to be outcome oriented. We can't just be we've delivered it, therefore we've delivered value. No, we have to see are people using what it is that we do. And similarly, the key point around continuously improving, again, when you think about how traditionally project delivery happens, not just in software, but in a lot of other organized industries, is kind of you do the project and then the project's done. And then you might do what like a lessons learned at the end. And it's like, well, what was the point in that? The project's done. These are all the ways we could have been better in the project. It's like, well, it's been and gone. So we're never going to do the project again. Whereas again, kind of view of trying to get better and just making small little tweaks to how you work. Again, I think is a core tenet to agility.
Yeah, it's a very. I mean, I've interviewed quite a few authors who've written books on this and related topics in the past, and I think one of the really fascinating things about it is that people often are probably surprised to hear, you have to argue for data. You have to make an argument that the focus should be on the business outcome. Things like that can, I think, be surprising to outsiders. But, you mentioned working for one organization, there can be a big bureaucracy, there can be incumbent kind of ways of doing things. And there can actually it's very common for organizations to sort of like, focus on delivering the project rather than focusing on, what's the actual outcome going to be. And then the really big change that happens when you're working on the project with a view to the outcome. And this is all happening kind of maybe even on a daily cycle.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I think I put it down to, and this is just my own opinion. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I think it's because I think why organizations fall into that trap a little bit is that the output is all within their control, and the outcome is you can influence it.
Right.
So I can put out a feature that you might want to use, but there's uncertainty there as to, they might not use the feature and therefore it might look bad. Whereas I can put it out and then I don't really care about that. But all that is within my control, largely within my control or within the control of the organization. And I always find that shift to outcome thinking, I think that's one of the core reasons why people find it so hard is that it's got to be so good that they actually buy it. It's like, yeah, because that's the ultimate measure of success, or they power with their cash, or they use the thing. And I'm a firm believer that that's why organizations still default to that other approach, because then it's all within their control. And then the worst thing that happens is when that's kind of showcased as a move to outcomes. I think that's where organizations really trip up, because then it's like, you're not actually really changing though, are you? You're just using some different words, but doing the exact same thing.
That's very interesting. I've never thought of that with that great distinction before, but, like kind of, I guess as it were, kind of like internal outcomes, which are under your control, and external outcomes, which aren't. So I'm going to probably, I step on all kinds of toes, but like, things like story points, for example, for anyone who's listening, this is a kind of thing where like, a story is kind of like a piece of work that you give to someone or give to a team. And then and you assign a certain amount of points to it if you actually achieve that, like deliver that feature or something like that. And like this can be confused for productivity because there's numbers, and I can draw charts and and stuff like that, and I can show my progress through the week and things like that. But a lot of that it's all focused on typically you're focused on the internal kind of stuff, as you say. That struck me so much, the stuff you can control, as opposed to like what's actually happening outside our organization, what's the actual impact of this on the people that we're here to serve and interact with out there.
Yeah, that was. I remember going through that kind of unlearning and relearning, or new learning, if you will, in my career, and yeah, I think it was at Royal Mail actually. I started that stuff, because we used to look at customer feedback on Twitter after we put a new feature out. Some of the feedback, it was so brutal. And it was like full of swear words. And you just like, oh my God, we've spent like 3 months on this. And then there's this person that's just absolutely slaying it. But it was a bit of a reality check because it was kind of like I come from a world where um and I remember like my CV before going was like the number of projects I delivered and they were on time and on budget. And it's like, well, actually, it doesn't really matter too much if you're on time and on budget, but no one uses it or they even hate it. That's even worse. So yeah, it's a big learning process that.
It's funny. I've never thought about being on the receiving end of British wit for product delivery. But yes, that would be real time British wit on Twitter. That would be brutal.
Yeah.
And so your book. So actually, one thing. So before there's the at the three sort of little concepts I wanted to focus on just to give people a sort of sense of the book. Flow, value, and culture. And there's more sections obviously, but one of it's there in the title, and I'm pretty sure the title actually changed it once or twice of the book, but there in the title is this distinction that's there in the book, and it's in like the many sort of awesome blurbs you got at the beginning and stuff like that, is this distinction between theory and reality. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that became a kind of framing element for the way you present your ideas in the book.
Yeah, so I think the agile industry as a whole in the last 18 months, 2 years, come under a lot of scrutiny. People have lost their jobs. Roles have been gutted from organizations. And I don't think it's all down to this, but I do think a large part of it is being unable to show results, and being unable to know actually what results should we even look for. And, I think increasingly you go to things like agile conferences or meetups, and it's not so much prevalent now, but certainly a few years ago, it was lots of theory and it was lots of, here's my new model, here's my new framework. And it was no, where have you done this? Like, where's the social proof behind this works? It might be a great idea, but where have you done it? And part of that is, I think it was when I was reading, well, it was John Smart's Sooner, Safer, Happier book, is really good for this because it talks about kind of how people adopt ideas. And you got the product innovation kind of model. I think it was Everett Rogers that did that. It talks about how people take on new ideas and new concepts. And I think agilists, if you want a term, for a long time have been kind of the early innovators group, where they like an idea because they can see that it's a great idea. But the large majority of organizations are in the people of the early majority and late majority, where they need to see social proof. They need to see it working in their context. And more through my journey as a practitioner, I started to realize that the way I was getting buy-in for ideas and taking stuff further and scaling stuff was through social proof and other teams being able to talk to other teams about it, rather than me just going around, cheerleading it around the rest of the organization. And increasingly, you'd hear conversations that people have with senior leaders or people in their organization, and even myself had this, and you get someone that you talk to, and they would go, yeah, but how's that work in the real world? And it would always be like, if you didn't have the experience of it, that you could answer that. And a lot of people don't, particularly if it's a new idea, because you've never done it, you come unstuck. So that was the big inspiration, was like more and more, I like seeing, for me, it's like, if I see a good idea, I want to put it into practice. I can't just, oh, well, that's just a great idea because it just makes sense. And in my writing over the last few years, like with blogs and conference talks, I've always wanted to be like, okay, show it in practice, because then people can get behind it more, rather than just, this is a great idea because I read it in this book. And it's kind of like, you need more than that now, because people, buyers of agility or people you need to convince around agility, they need the evidence. They need to see it working. They need to see the results that you can get from it. And results need to be like you mentioned about the story points example. Like it needs to be in a language they can understand. Like increase story points, even if you were to use that, which is an awful measure of agility. It's like it doesn't mean anything to your CTO or your CIO because it's like, well, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of the balance sheet. Whether you can show like increased revenue, reduce costs, increase speed to market. Those are things that make sense to everyone, or they can get them with a little bit of coaching. So yeah, it's kind of been the way I've seen the industry go in the last few years, and also thinking about like when I started my journey, I didn't have a clue about showing my impact, and there wasn't really much out there. If it was, it might have been behind a paywall. Around like how do I actually show that I'm good at this stuff? How do I even know I'm good at this stuff? So that's the big motivation is that if you are in one of these roles and you're struggling around, well, how can I better show my impact? There's a whole blueprint there I like to think that people could follow and start to show the real tangible value that they're adding.
Yeah. So in that context, let me just hit you with a direct question from your book. So what we still need, we still need concepts to talk about, and we still need words to, address them. So what is flow?
So flow, I'll give you my definition. I define it in the book because other people might say, well, you have things like a flow state where you're like at your ultimate happiness. And flow for me is basically the movement of work at all levels of the organization, work, ideally, potentially valuable work. So there we're looking at how frequently that work is being completed, how quickly we're getting stuff done, stuff that we started, how long has it been since we started it, how many things are we working on at once, and using things like flow metrics and flow data to help us with that.
And and so just in so just to dive into a little bit of detail there, what's a wait state?
A wait state. So if you were designing a flow system, you would map out the states in your process. So let's say you are a product development team and you have a user story or a work item, whatever taxonomy you want to call it. And so it's just an idea. So it sits on the backlog and then it goes into maybe some analysis or refinement or discovery. So you're doing some discovery. So it is active in that sense, you're working on it. And then you might say, right, we're happy with this. So we think it's good to start development. And then you might put it in a state of ready for development or waiting for development. So that's a wait state. That's where you're not actively working on it. And typically in things like Kanban boards, visualization boards that teams use, they have different work and wait states. So, it would indicate when work is being done on something and when maybe work is queued to start. Because ultimately, you don't want to be working on 100 things at once because you're never going to get anything done in that sense. So it just helps you understand, okay, when I have capacity, what's the next thing I can start based on what our priorities are as a team.
Yeah, that's a great description. I just remember looking at it and it reminded me of one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite movies, Ronin. I don't know if you know that movie. It's a Robert De Niro kind of spy movie.
I haven't actually seen it.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Jean Reno is in it. It's very good. And there's a scene where they're the team is they've set up shop in a kind of hotel room they're sort of going to be doing basically a heist. And one of them is getting impatient and he goes, I just wish we were doing something. And the Robert De Niro character looks at him and goes, we are doing something. We're waiting. And it's just this brilliant sort of way of sort of flipping it around, the idea of like that actually like kind of something being in that state could be exactly where it's supposed to be. It's not blocked. It's supposed to be in this state right now. And that's just a great example of how like, it could seem like, waiting's bad. But actually, no, not necessarily. And then these sort of concepts can be deployed very effectively. So in the next section of the book, you talk about value. And this is one of those very beguiling words that can seem very straightforward, but, not necessarily so. I think you talked about was it return on investment or something like that once, and how that can be misused. That can also seem very straightforward. But so, what do you mean by value?
So value for me is the impact of what it is that we do, what it is we work on, what it is we deliver, and also how we align with the goals and priorities of the organization. Because you can be delivering something of value, but if it doesn't align with the organizational strategy, it might not be the best thing for the organization, albeit it might make you feel great. But there's kind of a bigger purpose, particularly for people in large organizations, which is predominantly the people this book is aimed at, because that's where I've applied agility. You're invariably going to be part of a bigger system, a bigger vision, a bigger strategy. So it's also understanding, well, how much of what it is that we do actually aligns to the long-term direction we're going. And hopefully that's the majority, because then that's great from a motivational standpoint, because people can then understand their purpose.
The last question I have about your book directly is culture. So I'm hitting you with all the hard questions, but so what is culture?
So culture, for me, it's the mindset and behaviors that are expected or exhibited in our best teams, in the way we want to operate. Ultimately, the simplest definition is the way stuff gets done, the way people go about it. But I wanted to really kind of call out specifically things like, what do we expect to see in a great team? What does a great team look like in terms of like the way they interact with each other, the way they're always trying to get better. So yeah, that's kind of culture in a nutshell.
And to think of a specific example of culture, the one concept you address is psychological safety, which is, that people have a lot of different ideas about what that means, particularly maybe people who've never been part of an organization that takes it seriously. And so maybe you could, if you could talk for a moment, just the last thing about the book, about what psychological safety kind of really is in your opinion or experience.
In my opinion, it's being able to show up and be vulnerable and be honest and open with each other and not shy away from conflict, and being able to be open and direct about things when needed, and not being afraid to say I don't know or make mistakes. Because I've worked in organizations where they've latched on to like psychological safety as the kind of like the buzzword thing. They've read about Project Aristotle and how Google said it was their number one factor in their high performing teams, but they misinterpreted it as, oh, psychological safety means we have to be nice to each other, or psychological safety means we have to avoid conflict, or psychological safety means you can only go about conflict in one way. And yeah, increasingly over the years, I've kind of seen teams fall into that trap where they're scared of having difficult conversations because they think it impacts psychological safety, but actually it shows that they don't really have psychological safety in the first place. Because if they did, then they would be able to bring those things up. And I think what's fascinating about it as a concept is, or at least in my opinion and my experience, you're never going to get to a point where everyone has perfect psychological safety. There's going to be just certain incidents or moments where someone's going to have really low, someone's going to have really high, someone's like not even going to be focusing on it. And I guess that's why it's such a fascinating thing to go after, because a bit like the agility stuff, you're never quite 100% there. There's always something that you could be trying differently and to change the levels in the room. Like my psychological safety may be different than yours. So yeah, that's why it's an important thing, but also quite an interesting thing in terms of the continued discovery for what psychological safety really is.
Yeah, it seems it's one of the sort of issues that just endlessly fascinates me is like incredibly expensive, huge tech projects that completely fail. And why can, like, it's one of those things as an outsider, you're like, how can that possibly happen? We've got in Canada, there's a huge payroll, like federal government payroll system scandal that's been going on for years now, where incredible amounts of money and time and like who knows how many people can't get a payment system working. And I often find it fascinating that there's got to be like the idea that like something about psychology must be the answer there somewhere. And the idea that, I mean, this goes back to sort of like Toyota manufacturing and stuff like that, but having people being able to say, this isn't going to work, that's not right, without them feeling like they can't say it, or the person on but more importantly, the person on the receiving end not taking it, not having either them taking it or having it viewed by other people as an attack on them personally. It's the system that we're talking about here. The system is what's at stake. So that's a sort of like interesting feature of psychological safety is like that it's not actually about you, what you're talking about. It's about the system. And that's where the sort of like, I think that the mistake can come in where people are like, oh, it's about being nice and stuff like that. And it's like, well, being nice to who? Like the people who are going to try and get paid, you know, let's try and be nice to them maybe right now. So just to move on to the last part of the interview, I just wanted to ask you a little bit for a few moments about writing your book. Writing a book is really hard. Writing a book is a big decision. Writing a book can take a lot of time. I know you have a young son, and sort of writing a book also means bye. I'm going into that room over there. For a while, you can't talk to me. I've got to work on this thing. So, what was your process for writing this book? Did you have a room that you went to? Did you have a time of day? Did you have a structure?
Well, when I resigned at ASOS, we have like a 3-month notice period. So I was like, okay, that whenever I'm between jobs and I'm in that notice period, I like to take on a new project. So like before Nationwide, it was building an online course and like doing all the video editing, the filming that went with that. So when I was leaving ASOS, I was like, okay, well, I don't want 3 months where you do your handover in the first few weeks and then you just kind of sat twiddling your fingers like this is boring. Or at least that's my experience of notice periods. So I was like, okay, well, I want a project I can sink my teeth into. And for a long time, I wanted to write a book. It's always been on my goals list. But I never got to a point where felt like I was quite ready. And then it was the stuff done at ASOS. I was like, okay, right, I feel like I finally have something now to talk about. So a lot of it was kind of like using that time to write the book, like doing the handover stuff in the morning and then kind of freeing up the day and then, kind of cracking on. But there were still periods where I went through a bad writer's block or like just no motivation to write. And it's so different. Like for years I blogged. I mean, I can knock out a blog in a few days and get it done. But like a book is just so much more intense, and like you have to be, really on the ball. You have to be able to find those words. It's not as well. It's a book, so it's going to be, physical and digital is going to be there like forever. It's not like a blog I wrote 5 years ago where the writing's a bit naff. Like, so it has to all come together. And I kind of went through a period where the first month I was really rattling through it, and then I got a bit stuck, and I'd lost a bit of motivation, and I was close to the point where I was like, I might just shelve this, and then I just kind of again just really pushed myself. So no, you've started it, so finish it, and then it was just kind of like trying to do like a section a day or a chapter a day. Going through and like using like an e-reading software and just putting in like finish this section. So, and that doesn't work for everyone, but it worked for me in that it was kind of me telling myself, right, you're nearly there with this bit. This is the bit you need to add. And one of the books that I read that really, really helped was Alan Kelly's Books to Be Written. It's Alan. I'm pretty sure it'll be on Leanpub as well, because Alan's put a few books on there, and it was all about the self-publishing process, and it was just such an easy read, and it kept me going because it kept me like intrigued as to right when you want to publish, this is what you do. If you want an ISBN number, this is what you do. This is the difference between publishing on this platform, that platform. This is why Leanpub is more lucrative from a royalty perspective. And it's more I was learning that as kind of like motivating me as the end is in sight. This is what it can lead to. And then going into like consulting, I wanted something that differentiated me from others. And I've always felt like my blogs and my public speaking is good, or at least I think it's good, and people give me good feedback about it. But I was like, there's loads of people that do that. Not as many people have written a book. And then it was just other people that had books published. They were encouraging me as well. And I was like, okay, then I must have something worthwhile telling. So it's just those little bits where you kind of, when you're struggling, where you're not quite sure what the words are, or the words aren't quite coming to you, those type of moments just keep you going. But I try my best to not impact my home life. So there were some evenings for sure when my son had gone to bed where I might have picked up, the writing, but largely tried to do it during the day. And him and my wife were motivation as well. My wife in particular, she's motivated me. She's encouraged me for years to kind of do this thing. And I owe just so much to her, but also my son, because it's like, this is something that lives on after I go. And I like to think that, he'll see it and he'll be proud of what his dad did. So yeah, he's a big motivation for me in that sense as well. It got a bit emotional there just talking about it.
What's that, sorry? Oh, yes.
Like,
well, yeah.
Got a bit emotional.
Well, yeah, no, of course. Yeah. No, it's all such, writing a book is a really big deal. And thinking about the impact that it's going to have on your life, and that, your kid's going to read it one day and things like that is very important. The last question I always ask when the guest has used Leanpub to publish a book, this might be a simpler question for you than for some authors, because you used our upload writing mode where you just sort of upload your file and set up your book and your landing page and stuff. But if when you were using Leanpub, there was something that had you shaking your fist at it going, damn you, Leanpub, why is this so hard or stupid? Or if there was one magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
One magical feature or one thing. What would it be? I would, and maybe it's partly me just because I wrote the book on a separate e-reader and then just uploaded it. I find the navigation a bit tricky, but that's just because I don't use it extensively. So I end up like, I will Google view my Leanpub sales rather than knowing where to go. And part of it is like me being lazy, but it doesn't feel as intuitive as it should be. Like, for me, it would just be like, as soon as you log in as an author, you can see how many copies you've sold and what that means from a royalty perspective. So yeah, I think that would be it. And then maybe, and I don't know if it is available and I haven't seen it, understanding the analytics behind the people that are going to your page and then not buying it versus the people that are, and like how many people are naturally discovering it. But I will counter that with a feature that I love, is explaining to someone that's an author how much they've made compared to like other platforms, the royalty, also like the kind of like the elastic pricing model. Because for me, I was like, well, how's that going to work? Surely everyone's just pick the minimum, and fortunately, not everyone has. And I like that it's not conveyed as like revenue, like royalty this, sales this. It's almost like story told in that, oh, this is great, and actually, if everyone just paid the minimum, this is what you've got. But actually, not everyone's paid the minimum, which shows that you have a great book out there. So I think I like that in that it tries to make it more personal to the author, or at least it feels that way to me.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing all of that. My co-founder Peter will be very happy to hear about that last part. He wrote that. Yeah, so for anyone listening, just very briefly, Leanpub has a variable pricing model, as we call it. That term is used to mean other things in other contexts, but what it means in our context is when you sell a book on Leanpub, you set two prices for it, a suggested price and a minimum price. When people go to the book landing page, they see a slider that is set at the suggested price, and they can slide it left all the way down to the minimum price that the author set. They can leave it where it is, or they can move it to the right and actually pay more. And so we on the author side of things, we have a little kind of like a sort of concatenated kind of paragraph or two that shows numbers, live numbers in it, that explains like, if everyone had paid the minimum price, you would have earned this much, but people didn't all do that, et cetera. So it gives you some reassurance and framing around like how this is actually working in a kind of story format rather than kind of charts or something like that. But as you're pointing out, now we do have sales pages for individual books that show a kind of sales chart and stuff like that. We do have royalties pages that are kind of like, rows and columns and stuff like that. But it's a very good point that we don't have like kind of an author dashboard. Like, what's my world looking like right now? Like, maybe I have more than one book. How many people have been at this landing page yesterday? How many were there the day before? How many people that visited the landing page actually bought the book? Things like that. We actually don't have anything kind of coherent around that. And that's a very good suggestion. And it's particularly because it keeps people engaged, right? It keeps them authors coming back and thinking about how they can improve things. And with respect to navigation, we've had that before. We're working on a big redesign that we're calling V3 of Leanpub. So that'll be coming out sometime. The site will one day look very different. But there is a kind of a bit of an inherent, and I mean, I'm sure like things like Amazon have the similar kind of issue where, obviously at a very different scale, but where it's for buyers and sellers, right? So, like that trying to keep those things in your head when you're designing something can be kind of difficult. And people can come in and they're a seller, that's all they care about. But like the first thing people should see on leanpub.com is like from a buyer's perspective, probably. But that's kind of a little bit difficult. So that is an inherent thing. We always love actually getting feedback about things like that, and to hear that, for example, you're using Google to sort of find your way around Leanpub is an interesting thing to learn. So the book is Real World Agility by Nicolas Brown. And Nick, thank you very much for taking some time out of the evening in Krakow, where you are, waiting to go speak at a conference tomorrow. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us before you go out and explore the city.
No worries. Appreciate it. Thanks, Lee.